Have you ever wondered how the Vietnam War truly began? It wasn't with American boots on the ground in the 1960s. The seeds were sown much earlier, in the ashes of World War II. Let's travel back to a time when the world was redrawing its maps, and one nation's dream of freedom would ignite a conflict that would define a generation. After World War II, a powerful wave of change swept across Asia. Empires were crumbling, and the call for independence was echoing everywhere. In Vietnam, a French colony for nearly a century, this call was answered by a man named Ho Chi Minh. A charismatic and determined nationalist, he saw an opportunity. He founded the Viet Minh, a movement not just for communism, but for something more fundamental: Vietnamese independence. Their goal was simple: to expel the foreign powers that had dominated their land for so long. But France, weakened by the war in Europe, was not ready to let go of its prized colony. The French returned, determined to reassert control, and what followed was the First Indochina War. This wasn't a conventional war. The Viet Minh, under the brilliant military leadership of General Vo Nguyen Giap, mastered the art of guerrilla warfare. They used the dense jungles and rugged mountains to their advantage, striking at French forces and then melting back into the landscape for the French soldiers. It was a frustrating and brutal fight against an elusive, highly motivated enemy. The conflict dragged on for 8 long years, a grueling war of attrition. The French, backed by American funding, tried to lure the Viet Minh into a decisive, set-piece battle. They chose a remote valley in northwest Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu. Here, they built a massive, fortified airbase, confident that their superior firepower could crush any Viet Minh attack. They thought it was the perfect trap. They were wrong. What happened at Dien Bien Phu was a military masterpiece and a logistical miracle. General Giap's forces did the impossible. Tens of thousands of Viet Minh soldiers and civilian porters, using little more than bicycles and their own backs, hauled heavy artillery pieces through dense jungle and over steep mountains. Surrounding the French garrison, they dug miles of trenches, slowly tightening the noose. When they finally unleashed their surprise bombardment, the French were caught completely off guard. The siege lasted for 56 terrifying days. The monsoons turned the valley into a sea of mud. The fighting was relentless. Hand-to-hand combat in a maze of trenches and bunkers for the soldiers trapped inside. It was hell on earth. On May 7, 1954, the battered, exhausted French forces surrendered. The world was stunned. A small agrarian guerrilla army had defeated a major Western military power. The shockwaves from Dien Bien Phu were felt all the way in Geneva, Switzerland, where world powers had gathered to negotiate an end to the conflict. The resulting Geneva Accords were a compromise that satisfied no one. Vietnam was to be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. In the north, Ho Chi Minh would establish the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with its capital in Hanoi. In the south, a non-communist state would be formed, backed by the West. The plan was to hold nationwide elections in 2 years to reunify the country. But these were the peak years of the Cold War. The United States, guided by its domino theory, feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow. President Eisenhower's administration decided it could not allow a unified communist Vietnam. The planned elections of 1956 never happened. Instead, America threw its support behind a new leader in the South, a staunchly anti-communist nationalist named Ngo Dinh Diem. And so, the temporary division became a hard, ideological border. In the North, Ho Chi Minh consolidated power, a revered figure who embodied the spirit of Vietnamese independence. In the South, Ngo Dinh Diem established the Republic of Vietnam, with Saigon as its capital. Diem was a complex and controversial leader. While a patriot, His autocratic rule and favoritism towards the Catholic minority alienated many, especially the country's Buddhist majority. His government quickly became notorious for its corruption and brutal repression of all opposition. This widespread discontent in the South created fertile ground for a new insurgency. With support from North Vietnam, communist loyalists and other groups opposed to Diem's regime began to organize. They became known as the Viet Cong, emulating the tactics that had been so successful against the French. They launched a campaign of guerrilla warfare and political subversion. They targeted government officials, intimidated villagers, and gradually established control over large swathes of the countryside. For the soldiers of Diem's army, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam or ARVN, the fight was daunting. They were often poorly led and unmotivated, fighting an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. American military advisors arrived, trying to train the ARVN to fight a conventional war. But the Viet Cong didn't play by those rules. They moved like ghosts through the jungles and rice paddies, living among the people, making it impossible to distinguish friend from foe. The landscape itself became a weapon, a world of booby traps, ambushes, and constant, nerve-shredding tension. By the early 1960s, South Vietnam was teetering on the brink of collapse. The Viet Cong insurgency was growing stronger every day. And in Washington, a new president, John F. Kennedy, was faced with a critical choice: either cut his losses and let Vietnam fall or deepen America's commitment. The stage was now set. The ideological battle lines were drawn, and the first shots of a new, even more brutal war were being fired in the jungles and villages of South Vietnam. This is only the beginning of a long and brutal journey. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the full story of the Vietnam War, its fiercest battles, and its lasting impact in the next part. Thanks for watching, and if you found this history as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next.